They had been accused of conspiring to instigate the First World War, systematically discriminated and abused by their neighbors and government for years, separated from the population, crowded into filthy ghettos. And now they were uniformly rounded up and either shot into mass graves or deported by train to the tens of thousands of Nazi concentration camps to be exterminated like animals. This was the plight of the Jews, Gypsies, Slavic peoples, and all of whom Hitler viewed as racially inferior. With millions of human lives now at their disposal in these camps, German doctors, scientists, and pharmaceutical manufacturers decided not to waste an unprecedented opportunity for the advancement of their medical research and Hitler's baseless beliefs in racial science. This is part 2 of the story of the depraved doctors of the Third Reich. They disembarked the train, dehydrated to the point of hallucination, starved and weary from having to stand for days in an overcrowded cattle car, in the unbreathable stench of their own urine and excrement, and the smell of those who died on the journey. Signs along the tracks leading into the camp told the new arrivals the name of their destination: Konzentrationslager Auschwitz, known informally by the Germans as the KZ. Had they arrived among the first convoys, their journey might have ended in a mass grave. The Nazis had encountered a problem, however: the stench of tens of thousands of rotting corpses. Thus, the solution of burning the corpses was implemented, and the crematoriums were constructed. Now, the air that surrounded the deportees reeked of a new odor: burning flesh. Hopefuls among the new group remarked to each other that the smell might be a meal of cooked chicken waiting for them. Their first encounter was often with the camp's chief physician. For those arriving to Auschwitz after May of 1943, it was the young Schutzstaffel Obersturmführer, or senior storm leader, Dr. Josef Mengele. With a casual flick of the wrist, he and other such uniformed doctors sentenced the new arrivals to one of two fates. To the right side, able-bodied men and women, those who would be condemned to die a slower death through forced labor and starvation, and those who appeared interesting enough to serve as human guinea pigs. To the left side, women, children, the elderly, the crippled and infirmed, those who were given false reassurances of a shower, a warm meal, living quarters, and reunification with their loved ones. Panicked at the thought of being separated from their parents, young women sent to the right side would plead to go with their aging parents and grandparents into the left column, expressing tearful gratitude when the Nazis would permit them to stay with their family. Some survivors recount their lifelong grief from this moment, such as that of an older sister who encouraged her younger brother to go with the left column, to stay with their mother. She would never see either of them again. Parents who were selected for the right-hand column often protested being separated from their children. Many fathers and mothers would cling to their young children in desperation as the Nazi guards and capos forcibly separated them, shouting reassurances that they would be reunited. Even under a barrage of painful blows to the face and head from the capos' rubber clubs, terrified parents still did not relent their grip on their children. Eyewitness accounts from survivors state their abject horror as they watched small children having their limbs torn from their bodies in the struggle. The left column was then marched a short distance away, 300 yards across the camp, into the courtyard of a red brick building. Then, under a reassuring sign reading baths and disinfecting room, down a flight of concrete steps into a large room full of numbered hooks and benches. A prisoner in the camp, Dr. Miklos Niesli, recalls sadly that many among the group he witnessed went down the steps almost gaily. Here they were made to undress. The stubbornly modest women and young girls who refused were forcibly stripped. They were instructed to fold their clothes and keep their shoes organized so they could find them later. This, of course, was a lie. These final instructions were only to lessen the work of the Sonderkommando, as the clothes and any remaining valuables would be collected and sold to fund the Nazi war effort, or otherwise delivered to German cities in need of supplies. The Nazis simply didn't want the shoe sizes getting mixed up. The arrivals were then herded into a long room with wired metal columns spaced along the center. The doors were then locked, the lights switched off. A medical van would shortly arrive on the road above, perversely bearing the insignia of the International Red Cross. Uniformed men would exit the vehicle wearing masks and carrying canisters, moving to the small concrete pipes jutting above the ground over the shower room. They swiftly emptied a granular substance into the opening before shutting it and waiting for the screaming to stop. The first to perish would be the children and weaker adults, as they were trampled and crushed to death by their families and friends around them in their frantic effort to survive, to escape the rising cloud of suffocating gas. As he was present to witness one of these many occurrences, Dr. Niesli writes, "In order to be certain of their business, the two gas butchers waited another 5 minutes. Then they lighted cigarettes and drove off in their car. They had just killed 3,000 innocents." The right-hand column, meanwhile, had not moved. Dr. Niesli recounts his experience, writing, "Dr. Mengele ordered all the doctors to step forward. He then approached the new group, composed of some 50 doctors, and asked those who had studied in a German university, who had a thorough knowledge of pathology and had practiced forensic medicine,
to step forward. Be very careful, Mengele added. You must be equal to the task, for if you are not, and his menacing gesture left little to the imagination.
Dr. Neasley was an accomplished forensic and anatomical pathologist. He stepped forward. After being questioned by Mengele, he was then assigned to the KZ Sonderkommando. The story of the Sonderkommando alone is deserving of its own telling. For the sake of this story, it should at least be understood that they, like the Kapos, were prisoners of the camp. The Kapos, the Kameradschaftspolizei, the camaraderie police, were often convicted and violent criminals, chosen for their willingness for brutality. Offered significantly better living conditions and food, they were given auxiliary leadership positions over their fellow inmates. Faithfully serving the SS, even as prisoners themselves, they were charged with the discipline and even killing of misbehaved prisoners. Similar to these men, in exchange for keeping their lives and the provision of better conditions, the Sonderkommando did much of the dirty work in the crematoriums and medical labs, while the Nazi SS merely gave the orders. Auschwitz survivor and author Primo Levi writes of the Nazis' philosophy regarding this use of prisoners.
It is not enough to relegate them to marginal tasks. The best way to bind them is to burden them with guilt, cover them with blood, compromise them as much as possible. They will thus have established with their instigators the bond of complicity, and they will no longer be able to turn back.
In routine fashion, every 4 months, the Sonderkommando would be summarily liquidated. They were executed to prevent any single prisoner from witnessing more than the Nazis felt was allowable. A new group from an arriving train would be selected to replace them and to burn and dispose of the bodies of their predecessors. As a witness, Dr. Neasley was one of the few prisoners to have escaped death after passing through the gates of the crematoria. By the date of Dr. Neasley's arrival, Auschwitz was comprised of multiple adjacent or nearby camps. With increasing numbers of deportees arriving by train, a 3-pronged railroad track and additional crematoriums had been constructed at Auschwitz II. Also referred to as Birkenau, these added features were constructed in order to speed up the selection and gassing of deportees upon their arrival. With Birkenau serving as the primary extermination camp at Auschwitz, it likewise served as the experimental camp, with the nearby crematoria serving to dispose of the victims' bodies. Relatively few people ever had the opportunity to speak of the atrocities witnessed at these camps, for the vast majority were slaughtered almost immediately upon their arrival. It therefore goes without saying that these truly horrific stories have been primarily told by the only people who can: the survivors. The purpose for human experimentation varied among the different concentration camps around Germany and the Nazi-occupied regions. In part, German pharmaceutical companies took advantage of the unfettered access to living humans on which to test a variety of new vaccines and medications. Many more experiments were military-related, aimed at improving scientific knowledge of how to treat and prevent German soldiers' injuries, infections, illnesses, and subsequent deaths on the battlefield. Still further were those experiments conducted under the Nazi premise of proving the viability of their theories on race, their pseudoscientific belief in Aryan racial superiority. In pursuit of these ideologies, the approximately 200 offending Nazi physicians enjoyed complete freedom to act without regard to basic medical ethics and without any consideration for the health of their patients, their victims. Indeed, nearly all subjects endured incredible suffering, mutilation, and indescribable pain. The experiments were often deliberately designed to terminate in a fatal outcome for their victims. Founded in 1925, Interessengemeinschaft Farbenindustrie AG, or IG Farben, became a conglomerate of companies that would monopolize the country's chemical production and come to own all of Germany's major pharmaceutical industries. In a perverse coupling of scientific research and government-sponsored extermination, Nazi physicians received financial backing from and maintained close professional and research contacts with such leading medical institutions and universities, as well as an ongoing relationship with research laboratories. A strong supporter of the Third Reich, during the war, IG Farben sponsored numerous operations associated with the criminal activities of the Nazi regime, including the use of slave labor in factories built close to the concentration camps, such as that at Auschwitz. IG Farben played a decisive role in the German army's chemical warfare program, as well as contributing to the Nazi effort in exterminating unwanted peoples. IG Farben manufactured the cyanide pesticides, the cans of Zyklon B gas, that were used in the gas chambers. With regard to medical and pharmacological research projects, IG Farben was heavily involved in experimental programs using patients both from the Nazi regime's T4 euthanasia programs and those recruited without their consent from concentration camps. These projects included paying SS physician Helmut Wetter to test their newly developed drugs on deliberately infected patients at Auschwitz, as well as at the Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen camps. The subsidiary company Bayer was particularly active in Auschwitz. A senior Bayer official oversaw the chemical factory in Auschwitz III, or Monowitz. Most of the experiments were conducted in Birkenau, in Block 20. The Women's Camp Hospital, with Drs. Wetter, Edward Wirtz, and Friedrich Contress, testing newly developed drugs on deliberately infected prisoners. Taken from Auschwitz, hundreds of women were sold to the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company for additional unknown drug experiments, from which all known test subjects were noted in correspondence letters as having died during testing. The letters were sent to request more test subjects. Hitler's regime sponsored an additional series of inhuman experiments for alleged ideological, military, and medical purposes. They were undertaken under Heinrich Himmler's direct orders to gain knowledge of certain wartime conditions faced by the German Wehrmacht, or armed forces. The Nazi doctors considered military necessity adequate justification for their heinous experiments, saying that the prisoners were condemned to death anyway. There were several forms of war injury-related experiments. At the German concentration camps of Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Natzweiler, Buchenwald, and Neuengamme, scientists used camp inmates to test immunization compounds and antibodies for the prevention and treatment of contagious diseases. Nazi SS Dr. Kurt Heissmeyer eagerly sought to have his name on research which disproved the popular belief that tuberculosis was an infectious disease, and to develop a vaccination serum against TB. In November of 1944, with assistance from the camp's chief medical officer, Dr. Alfred Trebinski, 10 girls and 10 boys, aged between 5 and 12 years old, were brought from Auschwitz to Neuengamme. HYPOTHERMIA's experiments were conducted on hundreds of adults and the 20 Jewish children. Dr. HYPOTHERMIA lacerated the children's skin and rubbed tuberculosis bacilli into the wounds, or otherwise injected live bacterium into his victims' lungs to attempt to immunize them against TB. He also painfully excised the lymph glands from the arms of the Jewish children. About 200 adult subjects died from these experiments. The fate of the 20 surviving children, however, did not end in the camp. In mid-April of 1945, with Allied forces drawing closer, HYPOTHERMIA and SS Obersturmführer Arnold Strippel deliberated on their best course of action, realizing the war was lost. On April 20th, the children, their 4 adult caretakers, and 6 Soviet prisoners were transported to the nearby Bullenhauser school in Hamburg, which had been used as a satellite camp since October of the previous year. The children were told that they had to be vaccinated against typhoid fever before continuing the journey to another camp. Arriving at the school, the children were unloaded and were immediately taken to the basement and ordered to undress. One of the attending SS officers reportedly stated, "They sat down on the benches all around and were cheerful and happy that they had been for once allowed out of Neuengamme. The children were completely unsuspecting." Rather than receiving vaccinations, the children were then injected with morphine by Dr. Trebinski. Using lengths of rope, they were then hanged by the neck from hooks on the walls of the basement. The adults were similarly hanged from pipes in the ceiling. The Nazi SS men found it difficult, however, to kill the mutilated children. The first child to be strung up was so light, due to disease and malnutrition, that the rope would not strangle him. SS Untersturmführer Johann Frahm later shamelessly recounted that he proceeded to bear hug the child and had to use all of his own body weight to tighten the noose. Then he hanged the other children, 2 at a time, from different hooks. "Just like pictures on the wall," he recalled. He added that none of the children had cried. The German armed forces had suffered heavy casualties on the Russian front in 1941 to 1943 because of gas gangrene, a bacterial infection that produces an odorous gas in gangrenous wounds. These casualties and other combat-related infections generated an interest in creating a pharmaceutical treatment to replace surgery and amputation. Overseeing the experiments at Ravensbrück, Professor Karl Gebhardt and his assistants, Drs. Fritz Fischer, Hertha Oberhüser, Rudolf Rosenthal, and Gerhard Schlauski, began by testing newly developed sulfa drugs. Ravensbrück camp contained mostly Polish women, dissenters and troublemakers to the Nazis during their invasion and occupation of Poland. Foregoing the use of anesthesia, wounds were deliberately inflicted on camp prisoners, both men and women. The flesh of their victims' bodies and limbs would be filleted. The open wounds were then infected with bacteria such as streptococcus, gas gangrene, and tetanus, after which only some of the patients were given one of the tested drugs. When serious infections failed to develop in their test subjects' wounds, they resorted to more gruesome measures. Wounds were reopened and filled with dirt, sawdust, rusty nails, slivers of glass, and other matter. The lacerations were then stitched closed to see how infections would develop in the bone and living tissue. SS Chief Medical Officer Professor Ernst Robert Kravitz visited the camp to oversee the experiments, remarking that the experiments still did not fully resemble conditions on the battlefield. He suggested they try shooting the women to inflict more accurate battle wounds. Instead, Professor Gebhardt and Dr. Fischer resorted to clamping their subject's muscle tissue at both ends of the lacerated wound so as to cut off circulation, as was commonly observed in the shattered tissue of bullet injuries. Some of the women were sent to the gas chambers after these torturous sessions. Many died from the experiments. Few still fortunately survived to give their testimony during the trials. In addition to infection, methods were explored to deal with bone fractures and grafting. Prisoners' legs were intentionally broken. Not only were sections of bones removed and attempted to be transplanted, but also muscles and nerves in order to study regeneration of these body parts. Since bone grafting was already a known procedure, much of this was unnecessary torture. In an even more senseless effort to discover the efficacy of transplanting severed limbs and joints, physicians at Ravensbrück amputated legs and shoulders from their inmates, and then attempted to transplant them onto other victims' bodies. While death was a common result of these experiments, all of the victims suffered excruciating pain, mutilation, and permanent disability. In 1939, SS Dr. Sigmund Rasche, an officer in the Luftwaffe's medical service, became involved in testing a plant extract as a cancer treatment. Despite being recommended to the use of rodents, Rasche insisted on using human test subjects. Himmler agreed, and a human cancer testing station was established at Dachau. 2 years later, in early 1941, Rasche suggested to Himmler that high-altitude, low-pressure experiments be carried out on live human beings. His goal was to determine the effects of exposure at high altitude when German pilots abandoned their aircraft with or without oxygen equipment and were subjected to low atmospheric pressures. Accompanied by civilian physicians Siegfried Rüff and Hans Romberg of the German Experimental Institute of Aviation, the experiments were carried out in the spring and summer of 1942 using a portable pressure chamber supplied by the Luftwaffe. 5 to 15 prisoners were locked in the chamber, the interior pressure of which was then lowered to a level corresponding to very high altitudes, up to 68,000 feet, or 20,000 meters. Rasche would have them repeatedly subjected to gradual or sudden changes in the air pressure, both increasing and decreasing. Under low-pressure conditions, the victims became frenzied, tearing out their hair, scratching their faces with their nails, beating their heads against the wall, or screaming until they became unconscious. When the pressure was increased, prisoners were observed to undergo profound disturbances of consciousness. Ultimately, their lungs would rupture, causing them to collapse into fits of agonal breathing, otherwise known as death throes. those who survived the experiment often suffered from severe shock and mental disorders due to the hemorrhages occurring in their brains. After viewing a report of one of the fatal experiments, even Himmler remarked that if a subject should survive such treatment, he should be pardoned to life imprisonment. Dr. Rascher replied to Himmler that the victims were merely Poles and Russians, and that he believed they should be given no such amnesty. Autopsies were carried out on the victims, some of whom were still alive, in order to check for the formation of bubbles in their brain tissue. Tissue samples were subsequently removed from their brains, necks, lungs, sympathetic nervous system, liver, heart muscles, kidneys, and muscles from their limbs. Most of the victims died slowly from their injuries. Adding to his list of unethical medical studies, in 1942, Dr. Rascher conducted freezing experiments. He again wrote to Himmler, who granted his request, and it was not long before he was submerging prisoners in ice baths to measure the duration and intensity of their death throes. These experiments were also conducted at Dachau after the high-altitude experiments had concluded. Their purpose was to determine the best way of rewarming German pilots and sailors who had been stranded in the North Sea and suffered severe hypothermia. Dr. Rascher's victims were forced outside to stand naked in the snow, suffering painful frostbite and blistering cold winds for up to 14 hours at a time. They were alternatively forced into a tank of ice water for 3 hours. In an effort to determine how long it took them to freeze in water, pulse and internal temperature were measured using a series of electrodes. Their violent shivering, however, often disrupted these readings and disguised the irregular heartbeats of those who suffered fatal cardiac arrhythmias. Rewarming of the surviving victims was then attempted by different methods. Some were placed under sun lamps, with many having their skin severely damaged by burns. Others would have hot water forcefully irrigated into their stomach, bladder, and rectum. Many suffered excruciating internal blistering of their intestines. Himmler highly supported these experiments, attending some of them in person and indicating that anyone who opposed Rascher's testing should be considered a traitor who would allow German soldiers to die. In reference to an anecdote about locals who lived along the North Sea, Himmler reportedly said he thought that a fisherwoman could well take her half-frozen husband into her bed and revive him in that manner. And he added that locals believed animal warmth had a different effect than artificial warmth. Following his recommendations, Dr. Rascher requested 4 Romani women to be sent from Ravensbrück to Dachau. Warming was then attempted by placing the hypothermic victim between 2 naked women. In a display of his complete apathy for the suffering of his patients, Dr. Rascher evidently requested the transfer of his hypothermia lab from Dachau to Auschwitz, which had larger facilities, and where his victims might cause fewer disturbances. Apparently, Rascher complained that his concentration was frequently interrupted when the hypothermia victims shrieked from pain as their extremities froze solid. One witness later testified that some hypothermia victims were thrown directly into boiling water. Out of the roughly 300 prisoners used for these freezing experiments, about 80 to 90 of them died as a result, the remaining majority dying from other harsh living conditions and mistreatment in the camp. In 1951, a 3-page-long post-war deposition was uncovered, written by Heinz Reimer, reportedly one of the few known survivors of Rascher's hypothermia experiments. In addition to these, Reimer describes a series of viral infections and open wounds he suffered at the hands of the Dachau doctors, including Dr. Klaus Schilling's experiments with malaria.
This inhuman Nazi locked me up every day for 2 hours in a glass cage, and I had to endure thousands of Anopheles mosquitoes on my body. Once I could no longer stand the pain, I made an attempt of resistance against the mosquitoes, while I assumed that this would not be seen. But the doctor, if you want to call this beast like this, saw my attempt of resistance in the mirror. For this, I received 7 days of strict detention. But before I was led away to the detention, I received 25 lashes with a leather bullwhip.
Increasingly eager to generate new medical research and to make a name for himself, in early 1944, Dr. Rascher began experimenting with the effects of polygal, a substance he created from beet and apple pectin, which aided blood clotting. He predicted that the preventative use of polygal tablets would reduce bleeding from both gunshot wounds sustained during combat or wounds during surgery. Subjects were given a polygal tablet and then shot through the neck or chest. Rascher further tested his patented coagulant by observing the rate of blood drops that would ooze from freshly amputated legs and arms of living and conscious prisoners at the Dachau crematorium. They were, of course, provided no anesthesia. Rascher would also shoot his Russian prisoners in the spleen whenever he needed extra blood to test. He published an article on his experience of using polygal, intentionally omitting the nature of the unethical testing on live humans, and even set up a company to manufacture the substance, staffed by prisoners. Dr. Kurt Plotner eventually replaced Dr. Rascher as head physician of human experimentation at Dachau. Plotner also administered the hallucinogen mescaline to Jews and Russian prisoners as part of the Nazi search for a truth serum that could be employed as an aid in interrogations. SS Dr. Wolfram Sievers was the managing director of both the German Institute for Military Scientific Research and the Nazi think tank called Ahnenerbe, which sponsored the experimental research at Dachau. In addition to the experiments involving hypothermia and atmospheric pressure, in the late summer of 1944, Nazi physicians at Dachau conducted experiments involving the forced consumption of seawater and its effects on the human body. The post-war trials would determine that Dr. Sievers visited Dachau in July of 1944 to speak with Kurt Plotner and Dr. Wilhelm Begelbock, who ultimately carried out the seawater experiments, along with Dr. Hans Eppinger. The victims were some 90 German, Czech, and Polish gypsies. Deprived of food, they were given only brackish yellow seawater for days on end. They became so profoundly dehydrated that they were seen licking the floors after they were mopped, just to get a drop of water. The experiments caused excruciating pain, foaming at the mouth, and in most cases, madness. The Nazis also conducted experiments which involved unspeakable varieties of torture that carried no pretense of ethical scientific inquiry. They included additional wound and poison experiments. Reports of experimentation with weaponized chemicals on concentration camp prisoners begin as early as 1939 at Sachsenhausen. At the behest of Nazi scientists, prisoners were exposed to mustard gas and phosgene gas in order to test possible antidotes. Beginning in 1942, SS Dr. August Hirt, the director of the French Anatomical Institute at the Rijksuniversiteit Strasbourg, or Reich University of Strasbourg, initiated the conduct of human experiments with sulfur mustard at the concentration camp Natzweiler. Survivors and witness testimonies during the Nuremberg trials account that sulfur mustard was applied to the upper arms of several dozen prisoners, resulting in blistering and violently painful wounds that spread to the whole body and caused some inmates to go blind. The ointments then tested on the victims reportedly caused even further pain. Several prisoners would have their blisters and wounds reopened after a few days and then intentionally contaminated by the doctors with a combination of common bacteria to observe the development of infection. These experiments caused tremendous pain as they slowly destroyed the subjects' bodies until their deaths several days later. Dr. Hirt's final reports neglected to mention the circumstances of the experiments being conducted on living humans, nor the suffering of his victims. Like Dr. Hirt, Otto Bickenbach was a professor at the University of Strasbourg and an avid member of the Nazi Party. Since 1939, he had been researching possible treatments for the effects of the poison gas phosgene, which was used in combat during World War I. After reviewing and recorded testing on animals of his antidotes, Dr. Wolfram Sievers suggested that Bickenbach continue his experiments in connection with Hirt's weaponized chemical experiments at Natzweiler. According to surviving inmate Ferdinand Holl, the testing of phosgene gas on prisoners began in June 1943. According to his estimate, approximately 90 to 150 inmates were subjected to phosgene, 50 to 60 of whom suffocated to death in violent agony. Testing of phosgene gas then occurred again in 1944. 12 of the 40 inmates involved in these experiments were forced to take Professor Bickenbach's proposed antidote orally. 20 inmates received injections, and a control group of 8 inmates remained unprotected. Willi Herzberg, one of the survivors, told how Bickenbach himself led the inmates into the gas chamber, where he smashed phosgene vials on the ground. Bickenbach then left the gas chamber, and the doors were locked. After 10 minutes in the chamber, Herzberg overheard a muffled splashing caused by the bursting lungs of his fellow prisoners, who collapsed, foaming from their mouths, noses, and ears. His own breathing became distressed, and he had the feeling as if someone was sticking needles into his lungs. On his chest, he sensed a pressure, as if hundreds of kilos were put upon it, and he already thought that he would not survive this. According to Bickenbach's final report, 14 inmates sustained varying degrees of pulmonary edema, an excessive buildup of fluid in their lungs. At the initiation of Professor Karl Hasse, further poison experiments were conducted at Neuengamme. In early 1945, selected inmates were forced to drink decontaminated water that had been previously poisoned with nitrogen mustard gas to test the efficacy of the decontamination methods. Having investigated Hasse's findings, SS Oberfuhrer Helmut Poppendick deemed these tests insufficient. He urged Himmler to allow Hasse to conduct further testing, arguing that the ingestion of chemical agents be examined in more detail. Hasse evidently wanted to force 8 concentration camp inmates to ingest 8 different chemical agents in harmful doses, while another 8 inmates would be forced to ingest a lower dose that he considered harmless. in order to determine the threshold for overdosage. In February of 1945, Himmler withdrew his approval in consideration of the current situation. The Allied forces were drawing closer, and yet, this was by all accounts the first time Himmler refused to allow human experiments to be conducted in a concentration camp. At the end of August 1943, 86 Jews were gassed by SS Commander Josef Kramer at Natzweiler Stutthof for the purpose of constructing a collection of skulls and skeletons to be kept at the Institute of Anatomy of the Reich University of Strasbourg, under the directorship of Dr. August Hirt and with the direct assistance of Dr. Wolfram Sievers. Dr. Hirt reportedly wished to acquire a large collection of Jewish skulls and skeletons to form a museum dedicated to the soon-to-be-extinct Jewish race. Reports indicate that over 100 Jewish prisoners were initially selected at Auschwitz, chosen for their perceived stereotypical racial characteristics. Only 87, 29 women, and 58 men survived to finish the journey by train and forced march to Strasbourg. One of the men was apparently shot for refusing to enter the gas chamber. Kramer reportedly claimed to have pushed the rest into the chamber himself. Following their murder, some of the corpses were used as cadavers for students to dissect, while others were dismembered and placed in storage vats of alcohol. Ultimately, the anthropological project envisioned by Hirt would fail to be completed due to a lack of resources. In the meantime, new specimens were still being collected. Mere months before Allied troops reached Auschwitz, in August of 1944, a new convoy of deportees was arriving. Dr. Mengele was again waiting on the platform to peruse the new arrivals. He spotted two individuals of interest to him: a hunchbacked father standing next to his rather tall and handsome son, about 15 or 16 years old. The son exhibited a deformed right foot. Dr. Neasley writes, Mengele thought he had discovered in the person of the hunchbacked father and his lame son a sovereign example to demonstrate his theory of the Jewish race's degeneracy. The father and son were immediately sent to Dr. Neasley's quarters at the No. 1 crematorium. A note with Dr. Mengele's instructions was delivered to Dr. Neasley by their soldier escort, SS Oberscharführer Musfeld. Mengele wanted the father and his young son thoroughly examined and measured. They were then to be killed and examined again. Overcome with the horrific irony of the situation, Dr. Neasley writes, I, a Jewish doctor, had to examine them and then perform the dissection on their still, warm bodies. Oh, so shaken was I by the situation about which I was powerless to do anything at all, that I suddenly felt myself spinning close to the edge of madness. He expressed that only through the force of sheer willpower could he bring himself to conduct the examination. He was kind to them. He conversed with them about their life in the ghetto, about the sacrifice the boy's mother had paid in starving herself to death to provide them the additional scraps of food. After finishing their examination, Dr. Neasley offered them a warm meal. sparing them the knowledge that it would be their last. Within half an hour, Oberscharführer Musfeld returned, escorting them into the furnace room to undress. Dr. Neasley heard the Ober's revolver crack twice. Dr. Neasley's autopsy of the father and son would show nothing to verify Mengele's theories. Neasley bitterly expressed that their bodies could still easily be used to fuel Nazi propaganda. Having sent another 10,000 of the newly arrived men and women to their deaths in the gas chambers, Dr. Mengele arrived at the crematorium to listen to Dr. Neasley's report on the father and son. Mengele was determined not to have the bodies cremated, and asked Dr. Neasley what methods could be used to preserve the skeletons. With Mengele considering the proposal of dissolving the flesh with chemicals as too time-consuming, he ordered the bodies to be cooked in boiling water. Offered only these simple instructions, Dr. Neasley put the question of finding a vessel large enough for the job to Oberscharführer Musfeld. Evidently, even Musfeld was horrified by Mengele's request. 2 large iron casks were procured within the camp and were placed over a bricked fire in the courtyard. After 5 hours of boiling, Dr. Neasley discovered that their flesh was softened enough to fall away from the bone. The fire was put out, and Dr. Neasley waited nearby for the casks to completely cool before removing the remains. As dusk began to fall, he was startled by an approaching Sonderkommando. The man was screaming for him to hurry. Having finished their labor on the crematorium chimneys, a group of Polish prisoners had been waiting in the courtyard for their Nazi escort back to their barracks. While scrounging for food, they had happened upon the unguarded casks. They were eating the meat. Alerted to the nature of what kind of meat they had been eating, the Poles were sick, horrified, paralyzed. The skeletons were given a gasoline bath to dry them. Once finished, they were arranged on the same tables on which they had sat for their examination the prior evening. Dr. Mengele was highly pleased. He had brought several officers with him. They pompously examined certain parts of the skeletons and launched into high-sounding scientific terms, talking as if the 2 victims represented an extremely rare medical phenomenon. They abandoned themselves completely to their pseudoscience. Nazi propaganda never hesitated to cloth its monstrous lies in scientific apparel. The method often worked, too, since those towards whom these lies were directed usually had little or no critical faculty and accepted as fact everything which bore the regime's stamp of approval. The skeletons were packaged and mailed to Berlin. While such cruelty was not reserved to merely one among these men and women, these doctors, the types of specialized experiments and levels of brutality conducted at Auschwitz under the directorship of Josef Mengele and his staff are incomparable. In his fervent efforts to prove himself, to validate Hitler's racial theories and bring about the rise of the Aryan race, neither man, woman, nor child would be spared by the man they would come to refer to as der Todesengel, the angel of death.